Welcome to another quick hitter from the Pride of Detroit POD cast. I'm Chris Perfett, the adequate host at Chris Perfett on Twitter. Joining me, Jeremy Reisman, the fearless leader at Detroit Online, back again here. This isn't going to be draft related. We have a big Monday POD cast coming out about that's going to include some of the day three stuff, including Colby Sorsdal. I think I said his name right, from William and Mary, who was the 5th round pick, and whoever the 7th round pick is. We're kind of recording between rounds right now. John Whitaker is also with us at Whitaker, WHITICAR. The reason we are recording this right now is because we want this out on the feed real quick, because one of the things that happened before the Sorsdale pick is that the Detroit Lions traded away DeAndre Swift, their running back, to the Philadelphia Eagles, which in a move I believe now represents a addiction of the Philadelphia Eagles to Georgia Bulldogs. One that they probably need to go to rehab for, if we're being honest. Let me read you the terms of the trade before we get into it and why this trade happens. Jahmyr Gibbs. But the Eagles received DeAndre Swift and a 2023 7th round pick, 249, where the Lions were originally at. The Lions are moving up in 2023 in the 7th round to 219, moving up 30 spots. And then the impressive part of the trade is a 2025 4th round pick. That is 2 drafts from now. I know there is the contingency that the Eagles could get a compensatory pick if Swift ends up walking in free agency, but that doesn't affect what the Lions got at all. So that's the haul, Jeremy, that the Detroit Lions got for DeAndre Swift. What are your immediate thoughts to start us?
I mean, obviously the trade itself was not a surprise at all. As soon as they selected Jahmyr Gibbs, it was pretty much on the table. And then once we heard Brad Holmes at the end of night one, where he was like, "Yeah, he's still on our roster," we're like, "Oh, so I have to pre-write this now." And in fact, I did pre-write it, and in fact got it out seconds after the news broke, because all I had to do was input Philadelphia Eagles, and the article was done. So that wasn't a surprise at all. It is kind of nice to see him go to his hometown. I'm sure that played well for him. That's another thing I want to get into in a minute here. But the trade terms are yeah, that's what's interesting. You jump up a little bit. You jump up basically the entire first round, go from the bottom to the top, the 7th round, I should say. I'm sorry, and then you get that future 4th round pick. Which, I mean, once the rumors, the smoke was clearing, I thought they were going to get like a 6th, maybe even like a conditional 6th. Like this is a good return for the Lions. This is a guy that clearly wasn't part of their future plans. This was a guy that was probably going to walk in free agency. And unlike Adam Schefter, I don't assume that once a player walks in free agency, that you're going to get a compensatory pick for him, because I don't think anyone's going to spend a ton of big money on an injury prone guy like DeAndre Swift. And you also have to not spend any free agent capital if you're going to get a compensatory pick. So, it's a good return for the Lions. It's an unfortunate end to Swift's career, and unfortunately, that's kind of been a kind of common theme with a lot of these draft picks from the previous regime. They trade Jeff Okudah, they trade DeAndre Swift, they trade TJ Hockenson, they trade Matthew Stafford. Moving on from a bunch of these guys and not getting outside of Stafford at all what you originally paid for them. But that's the Lions turning the page. That's the Lions trying to salvage what they can out of guys that weren't going to get second contracts here, and I can't blame them for that. And so overall, it again, sad to see that era come to an end, but it had already come to an end once Jahmyr Gibbs was a pick, and the Lions did well to really benefit from that way and get a good enough return where I think Lions fans should feel fine about it.
I'm in a similar boat, and I think probably the best word to describe this is just disappointment, really. I mean, this has been a long line of the Detroit Lions drafting running backs early, and we've seen the flashes that it's like, wow, this can be a top tier running back. And unfortunately, just injuries and other issues pop up, and it doesn't materialize. And then we end up shipping them off for less than what we used to acquire them. And it's sad that Swift is the latest in this batch of running backs, because we saw those like exciting plays. The touchdown that he had this last year where he fell down midway through the play, got back up, scampered, and got into the end zone. Like, those are the things that's like, wow, this is a talented player. And unfortunately, injuries took their toll, and injuries also take a toll mentally, because I think
Yeah.
when you have these nagging injuries, I think like shoulder and knee and stuff, you're probably a bit more hesitant to be a bit physical or take these hits. And I think for Swift, down the road, especially last year, decision making was a problem where he wasn't following his blockers properly. And maybe it's him kind of questioning himself. And one thing I loved about us being on Hard Knocks this past year is we got an insight from Deuce Staley into that running back room. And it was like, Swift, I know you can be this dog. You can be one of the top five running backs in the league, but you got to trust the what we put in front of you, and you got to trust yourself. And unfortunately, we didn't really see that.
Yeah, and Deuce ends up going to Carolina as well, which probably loses one of the guys who was really fighting to get him to improve and get him onto the field. So I don't know, you lose you lose your proponent like that in a place in Detroit. Like it's tough. It's very tough. One thing I will say about the trade value is that this is absolutely going to probably, watching how Brad Holmes does this could, that fourth round pick, depending on where it is, could easily probably be used to trade up into a top 100 again. So it is fascinating to watch that deal come back. Now it's a couple of years down the line. We'll have to revisit it there when that happens. What I will say on DeAndre Swift is it kind of feels rough. The As you said, Jeremy, we've gone through a long line of this. On Johnson, Amir Abdullah, guys who we thought had a lot of talents, and Swift really, I thought, delivered some of it in the burst. One of the things that's really fascinating is there seems to be a lot of disconnect about what he has been able to do in Detroit. I'm not going to say that there's no fresh ground for him in Philadelphia. He's going back home. He's going to a squad that uses very heavy running back by committee. He'll be part of a rotation that could very well give him the fresh start he really needs, especially with a contract coming up. But at the same
time, he also goes from one good offensive line to the best offensive line.
Yes. But I feel like there is kind of a disconnect. Not going to read this from one of the. I'm not going to read who exactly put this out, but some people are saying that there's not a lot of difference between what the Lions have now and David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Jamal Williams / DeAndre Swift, which is ludicrous. But at the same time, like, I think the national media opinion of DeAndre Swift, for one reason or another, is a lot higher than what we. And I saw Ben Raven complaining about this, that what we here at the ground here in Detroit have witnessed of Swift. There seems to be a complete disconnect, Jeremy, between these two perceptions of this player.
Yeah, and I think actually both sides are exaggerating a little bit, because DeAndre Swift is a guy who had nearly 1,000 yards every season in Detroit, all 3 seasons, and that's all-purpose yards.
Yeah,
that's
including
receiving yards.
He was a top 10 last year in offensive production for running backs, I believe I saw.
Yeah, and so like, he can be a weapon, and I think there is a little bit of anxiety amongst Lions fans that he could do really well, and he might do really well in Philly. But the fact of the matter was, he didn't have a spot here, and keeping him around as a third string guy, as a guy who comes in case of injury, I just don't think he would have liked that very much. I don't think you would have gotten a lot out of that. Like maybe Jahmyr Gibbs gets injured, maybe David Montgomery gets injured, and you'll need a guy. The Lions will have a guy. They'll be okay. But relying on DeAndre Swift to be that guy when he himself couldn't stay healthy for a large portion of basically every season, that's kind of a waste. And then if he has this third season where he doesn't do much, he's an injury replacement. He'll hit free agency. You won't get a comp pick because he won't show that much. But at the same time, like this isn't a guy who's going to come to Philly and suddenly be a top 5 running back in the league. He could be very good. His production numbers, because of that offensive line, may be very, very good. But again, the injury stuff, I also think that the vision stuff is not something that just popped up last year, right? That is something he's suffered his entire career. And that's really frustrating from a coaching point. Like, we saw how much that ticked off a guy like Deuce Staley. It ticks off a guy like me because I don't know. Either way, it's just he's a decent player that couldn't find the field much, and he's still young. He's starting somewhere new. He'll practice on not slit film turf, so maybe that helps him a little bit. And who knows where the future goes. But I don't think Lions fans should really get frustrated over anything like this when there wasn't a spot for him here, and the Lions got decent return for a running back. Go back and look at running back trades for guys that of his caliber, right?
To get a fourth rounder on day 3.
The closest thing I could find before this, just to kind of like see what his value was Sony Michel. And the Patriots got, I want to, it was either a 5th and a 6th or a 6th and a 7th.
And that was, Sony Michel went in the first round.
Right. And Sony Michel had some injury issues as well, but I would say the Lions got equal to that value or better. And so this is just what happens with running backs, right? This is why I don't say draft them. Like you eventually trade them away or cut them for pennies on the dollar.
As always, people want to believe one side fleeced the other. I think it's a trade that benefits both sides.
I agree.
I don't know if he'll make 1,000 yards just by how much of a timeshare that Eagles backfield is. We have to see their final roster, but he's going to fill kind of the spot that I believe Kenneth Gainwell was fulfilling for them right now. So it's just hard, man. It's hard when you have that many mouths to feed. But John, your thoughts?
I want to focus a little bit less on the player, and I think actually the pick, because Jeremy mentioned, I think coming into it, a lot of us thought, well, now they've drafted Gibbs, the Lions don't really have a lot of leverage in this trade. It's at the point where, if you're going to trade him for a 6th-round pick, like, is the value really worth it? And I think being able to get a 4th-rounder, even in 2025, is totally worth it because, I mean, technically, the regime could totally change by then. Who knows? But that's just something you have in your back pocket. And like a 4th-round pick is not unsubstantial. That can still be a starter. At the very least, that can be a good development piece. There's a lot of value with that, especially for someone like Swift, who, as we said, is not in the future forecast for the Lions. And, it also saves them about $1 million and a bit in terms of cap space too, short term. So that's another benefit to that. And I think Philly, they get someone who now is going to be in the role he should be, which is kind of a rotational guy who doesn't get too many touches. So that way he can stay healthy and stay electric. So I think it's definitely a win for both teams. Although I do think from a Detroit perspective, I wouldn't be upset about it. You can look back at the pick and be regretful about it. But I think, as I said earlier, disappointment is really just the biggest thing. It's sad to see a guy you like not pan out.
This has been a complete overhaul of the Lions running back room here, especially with the departure of Jamal Williams on top of it. But again, we have to impress that they clearly have a vision in mind, because Montgomery they picked up in free agency, and there was already rumors about Swift then. And Jahmyr Gibbs was just kind of the nail in the coffin. Like, not a bad player, but you just don't have a spot here anymore.
It's really kind of crazy. I feel like this is also, you mentioned that they turned over the running back room. At this point, they've really turned over everything but the offensive line, right? Like the wide receiver room, way different. The defensive line.
That happens when you have a new front office, yeah.
Yeah, way different. The secondary got overturned completely this year. And obviously the linebacking crew got overturned in the past year, including their 1st-round pick this year. So I feel like maybe this is kind of like the closing of the book almost officially on the previous regime, right? Like this feels like they've traded away their last valuable piece from that regime. Obviously, you still got pieces, like I said, on that offensive line that are going to stick around and won't. But it just, again, like it's moving on from an inefficient draft pick, and hopefully all the ones that Brad Holmes are putting in his place are upgrades. They're certainly cheaper for the most part. I guess Jahmyr Gibbs and DeAndre Swift are probably costing about the same. But either way, like it's a turning of the page, and hopefully this regime hasn't made any of the same errors that the previous one did.